My favorite definition of mindfulness comes from the mindfulness teacher Jon Kabat-Zinn, and the definition that he has used is paying attention to the present moment on purpose without judgment.
Today's guest, Roy Remer, is teaching caregivers how to practice mindful caregiving, creating sustainability and calm during the caregiving experience. Hi, I'm Helen Bauer, and this is the Heart of Hospice podcast. The Heart of Hospice podcast is your source for compassionate and informative discussions about hospice and end-of-life care. I'm a certified hospice and palliative care nurse with over 15 years of experience. Whether you're a caregiver, someone with a serious illness, or you simply need to know more about hospice care, this podcast is for you. Join me as we explore all the aspects of hospice, from the details of caregiving to the emotional and spiritual dimensions of end-of-life journeys. For more resources and to connect with me, visit theheartofhospice.com and find us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Keep listening for today's episode.
This is the Whole Care Network. Helping you tell your story one podcast at a time. Content presented in the following podcast is for information purposes only. Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the host and guest, and may not represent the views and opinions of the Whole Care Network. Always consult with your physician for any medical advice, and always consult with your attorney for any legal advice. And thank you for listening to the Whole Care Network.
This episode is being sponsored by Halo Care. Whether you're supporting an aging parent or planning for your own independence, Halo Care empowers you to live confidently at home. From personal care and home safety to meaningful social connection, Halo Care gives you peace of mind knowing someone's always there. Learn more at halocaregroup.com/USA or check the show notes for the link. Halo Care, where technology meets compassion and home feels like home.
Roy Remer is the author of Zen Caregiving, How to Care for Yourself While Caring for Others. He's an educator and an end-of-life caregiver. He's the executive director of Zen Caregiving Project in San Francisco and the lead creator of the Mindful Caregiving Education curriculum. Roy is a dedicated practitioner in the Soto Zen tradition and a student at San Francisco Zen Center. We began this conversation with Roy talking about advanced care planning and the need for it, my need for it. Roy and I shared some personal experiences with advanced care plan conversations. Mindful caregiving is one of Roy's main strategies he encourages for caregivers to use. And in this conversation, he explains what it is and how caregivers can use it for their benefit. He also goes into detail about how mindfulness can increase the caregiver's ability to care for their person. Compassion is another part of mindfulness that Roy focuses on in his new book, and he shares his most important advice to caregivers who are just getting started. You can purchase your copy of Zen Caregiving, How to Care for Yourself While Caring for Others from major booksellers, and connect with Roy online at zencaregiving.org. So I invite you to take a deep breath as you listen to this conversation with author and end-of-life educator Roy Remer. There's a lot to learn. Roy, welcome to the Heart of Hospice podcast. It's good to have you with me.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here. I appreciate the opportunity.
It's going to be a great conversation. I'm excited to learn from you and to share your work with my listeners. We're going to start out with an icebreaker question, and it's not as daunting as it sounds. I try not to ambush my guests with anything too deep, but I pulled it from the Dementia deck. If you're familiar with the death deck and the end of life deck, they're conversation starters. So the Dementia deck is the latest product. And so here's your question for today. When I approach late stage dementia, A, pull out all the stops, do everything to keep me alive. B, no surgeries, no tubes inserted, no cancer treatment. Or C, focus only on my comfort and the things that bring joy to my life.
That's an easier one. I've been doing this long enough to just know, for me, it's definitely focus on comfort care and quality of life. Yeah, that feels most essential. It feels like, that's the way I want to spend my final days. Who doesn't love life? But, extending life for just the sake of more time, not for me. I want to just be as comfortable as possible. And and ideally, and we'll be able to get more into this, but ideally all the hard work of preparing myself and my loved ones for my death has already happened by that point. So it's all about comfort and joy. Just bring me my favorite music and let me look out at some trees and the sky. And that seems like for me, that's a good death. Yeah, for sure.
I like that. I like the way you say, for me, that's a good death. Because each one of us gets to decide what a good death looks like. So I got to ask you, I'm going to put you on the spot. This is a bad icebreaker question. Have you done your advanced care planning? Do you have your advanced directives in place?
Yeah, but I have. I've had them in place for many years, but I appreciate the question because this is a question I ask people often. But when I'm asked that question, it's kind of, a little alarm, like the ones that go off on my phone, because I often will tell people it's not a one and done. We change as we grow and get older. So we want to go back and review those from time to time. I have a dear friend who has assigned me as his, proxy for medical care. And, his advanced medical directives are sitting in my file cabinet here. And for a few months now, I've been meaning to, tell him we need to review those again because people change. So, I appreciate the question.
Was there any milestone or event that made you think, oh, we need to revisit that?
Well,
or is it just time?
Oh, I see. No, it really has been about witnessing people at the end of their life and watching the way the caregivers, both family members and the clinical team around this person, supporting this person, will turn to those to decide how to person comfort. I'll tell you a story which always saddens me and amuses me. And there was a man living at our 6-bed residential care facility. He did not have much family, but someone, a cousin or something, was able to convey to the care team that this man enjoyed Hawaiian slack key music, which is beautiful music. It's that acoustic guitar. And I was working at the guest house at that time, and every time I would walk upstairs and into that fellow's room, the same 3 or 4 songs were on a loop and playing. And I thought to myself, this poor guy, what if he had conveyed to someone years ago that was his favorite music, and then he kind of, it fell into disfavor, or maybe he wasn't so crazy about it anymore. And now he can't do anything about it. And here's his music playing again and again. And, for me, it was such a reminder that, we want to ask for what we want at the end of life. Two things, but one is we do want to go back and stay current on those wishes, those desires. But the other thing that I often say to people is that while these end of life conversations are so important, they're so essential in terms of conveying to a trusted friend or loved one or a spouse, what we want at the end of life. I think the real work for us is to live our lives in a way that prepares us to get what we don't want at the end of life, because there are no guarantees. We can ask for what we want, and we should ask for what we want, but often we don't get what we want. We all have a vision perhaps for how we want to live those final days. And I've seen a lot of people live their final days just with a lot of resistance, a lot of resentment, a lot of anger. And that's understandable, but that's not the way I want to live my final days, no matter what the circumstances. I want to be able to relax into not just acceptance, but even surrender to my circumstances. And I think that takes practice. So,
Yeah,
anyways,
absolutely.
yeah, so not so much an event, just, I've had the benefit of witnessing a lot of people reach the end. And so I have had many of these reminders. Yeah, and I know what it means to change and evolve. So our tastes change for sure.
Yeah. Well, and I think aging, and if you have a serious illness or even a chronic illness, priorities change. Priorities change. That's why even after we've admitted a patient onto hospice, we continue to ask, is this still what you want? Is it time to introduce this? Have you reconsidered this? The reason I like to ask about advanced care planning and ask my guests if they have actually done them is because I'm very open on the show that I have not done my advanced care plans. I have a will that's very old. My children, who are grown and gone and have their own children, are supposed to be in the care of my sister if I die, which they have two kids of their own. They each have two kids of their own. So I think that ship sailed, right? They're grown adults now. And obviously it needs to be redone. But I have attempted in the past to use various advanced care plan tools, booklets, workbooks, different documents. And it's very emotionally charged.
Right.
At least I find it that way. And I'm sure that's something that a lot of people experience. And so I left off. I didn't finish.
Yeah.
And of course now at my age, I'm 60. These are things I need to think about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's so true. And, you said something that I think is so important. And, I've done a couple of these different classes on how to guide people through filling out or completing their advanced medical directives. And they don't really touch on the emotional component in terms of how to hold space for that when it shows up. And it's going to show up, as you say. And so if we're going to be supportive in completing those really important documents, we have to prepare ourselves to, be the container to hold someone's big emotional experience. So common. Here I've been working in hospice since 1997, and I can't remember what year I started, but I would go home to visit my parents. I live out here in California. My parents live where I grew up in the Detroit area, and I would go home and I would sit down with them with the 5 wishes, and talk about what do you want at the end of life. And it was too much for my mom. She just couldn't have that conversation. She had always been a very emotional person. Her father died when she was very young. She never got any support around that grief. And it was just not something she could do. And my father was a little bit more open to it, but he would shut it down as well because he could see the emotional pain it was causing my mother. So when my mother went into the hospital and then very quickly into the ICU, she had not clarified for us what she wanted.
Mm.
And so the burden of having to make these important decisions shifted to us, you know. And I have a dear friend whose father had a major stroke, and she flew back to the Cleveland area. And her father, on the other hand, had been very clear with her what he wanted should he end up on life support. And so for her, she was basically carrying out his wishes rather than having to make a decision for him. And so the contrast between those two stories has been really important to me in terms of, you know, thinking about advanced medical directives and and I'm not trying to make you feel bad here, but, you know, what a gift it is to, you know, the people we leave behind to get those things completed so people know. You know, I had an idea of what my mom would want, just given who she was, but it would have been nice to have felt like I was just executing or carrying out her wishes rather than having to make that call for myself, you know.
Yeah.
So anyway, this is rich territory, and we've come so far, right? Like since you started getting involved in this work, you know, there's been so much movement around advanced medical directives and end of life wishes and things. So it's good. We're heading in the right direction.
I think so. And I don't mind being reminded that I need to take care of them. What I hope is that the cumulative peer pressure from all these people I know in the death and hospice space will eventually make me just suck it up and take care of my advanced care planning. It was, you know, it was when I had grandchildren that I really found it difficult to think about my advanced care plan. You know, that's a very tender part as a grandmother.
Sure.
I've got these 4 little people. And for me, that immediately became much more emotional because my kids are grown and I've seen a lot of their big milestones. It's different with little ones. So, but no, I like to be very public. I think that hospice clinicians, end-of-life workers, are really no different when it comes to being reluctant or having difficulty getting those advanced care plan and having those conversations. So I like to be I'm very open about the fact that I have not taken care of business. But I think it's important for people to know.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, as leaders in this field, I think it's important for us to be able to say, yeah, I've been through that process and have, you know, dealt with the emotional content around it if we're encouraging others to go through that process as well. And this feels really important. You know, we at Zen Caregiving Project, we train these wonderful volunteers to sit with people living with long-term chronic and terminal illness. And gosh, you know, if I'm going to send someone to the bedside where so much is falling away and so much grief is arising, you know, I really want to make sure that those folks have really steeped in that territory themselves so that when they witness something and emotions start getting triggered, they're really clear, like, this is my stuff, you know, and they know what the default emotions are. And so there's real clarity. And I think it minimizes the emotional enmeshment that can happen sometimes when we're with someone who's nearing the end of their life and they're really in their grief. You know, and this is the reciprocity of care that we talk about, right? Like, we're in this with them. But I think it's really helpful to really spend time in that territory, even when it's really painful for us.
It's the difference between saying, this is your stuff and this is my stuff, instead of saying, this is our stuff. This is human stuff. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I think, you know, it's easier for us to recognize our common shared humanity when we have a level of intimacy with our own emotions and our own stories around loss, and not just loss that has occurred, but just the future loss that we'll experience, whether it's with our kids or our grandkids or or partners,
Yeah. I think the perspective that you gained in your experience with your mom, it changes how you move and how you provide care and support. I think personal experience in this with these particular things, it changes how we provide care for other people in a good way, or at least it should be a good way.
And, one thing I also realized in that experience was the way, at that point, I had been doing this work for maybe, 15 years or something.
When your mom became sick?
Yeah, well, my mom was at the very end of her life. And I realized, well, both were true, that all that time working in the end of life space prepared me, and there's no way that could have prepared me to experience that loss, we talk about how the grief space is uncharted territory, and that was really driven home in that experience. Like, there was no way I could know what to expect. But I was able to hold my own experience of, being in this inconsolable space, this overwhelm. That I think about the night before we were going to take her off life support, and what a horrible night that was. And just the only thing I knew was to just keep breathing. It's a night filled with so much grief and doubt and questions, and but it's such a gift to do this work, and nothing can prepare you for the kind of loss when it's a loved one. Yeah,
it's true.
That's the bad news. Sorry.
Yeah, that's the bad news. We don't have all the answers. The good news is we are learning to be human along with everybody else. And I don't think
that's right.
I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And as one of the people who gets to the privilege of being at someone's bedside, that's an incredible gift to us. We get to be lifelong learners the whole entire time we do this work. After the break, Roy is going to offer his advice to new caregivers.
What if aging at home didn't have to mean being alone? At Halo Care, we're redefining what at-home care can be, combining cutting-edge technology with real human compassion. Our 24/7 Care Hub team is always there, offering peace of mind for families, caregivers, and seniors alike. With Halo Care, safety at home comes first. Through smart home technology, wellness monitoring, and personal connection that helps people live independently and confidently. Whether you're a family caregiver, a healthcare professional, or someone looking for extra support to stay at home, Halo Care is here to help. Visit halocaregroup.com/USA or check the show notes for our link, or call 888-247-7102 to learn how Halo Care can make home the safest place to be, because care should always feel personal, human, and connected.
So, you are doing some amazing things. You have a new book, Zen Caregiving, which is about self-care, except in a little bit of a unique way. You teach mindful caregiving, is how you describe it. So how do you define that? And what exactly does that bring to a caregiver to practice mindful caregiving?
Sure. Well, I think of mindful caregiving as moment-to-moment self-care. So the term self-care is pretty loaded these days. People throw it around pretty easily, and sometimes not so thoughtfully.
Yeah, so, totally overused.
Really overused. And if we see a caregiver who's struggling, it might be an easy thing to say, well, maybe you could make more time for self-care, And as a caregiver, that's not really what we want to hear, because so many caregivers are so burdened and they are so stretched for time. So how do they make time to, keep their medical appointments, or, take a day off for a nice hike, or, get to the hairdresser or whatever. So when I think of moment-to-moment self-care or mindful caregiving, it's really about using the activities that we already engage in on a daily basis in our life and using those activities to cultivate mindful awareness or present moment awareness. So I'll give a very practical example. You may be a caregiver who is showing up to support a parent, and you may find yourself, doing laundry or washing dishes. Well, if you can give your full attention to the task at hand, the folding of the warm, freshly dried towels, for instance, and feel that warmth in your hands and the sensation of the fabric as you're folding it. And when distractions start to come in, like, oh, how am I going to arrange this medical appointment, next week for my mom? Or, what am I going to make the kids for dinner? Let those thoughts go and just come back to the experience of folding this laundry. That's really not so different from sitting upon a meditation cushion, following the breath, and watching the mind as thoughts percolate up and the way our attention gets hooked to those thoughts. And before we know it, we're somewhere else completely. So it's really about, focusing on the present moment, no matter what we're doing. So, I don't want to sound like, caregivers need to go out and buy a meditation cushion and find a quiet place in their home and a candle and a meditation bell to cultivate this kind of mindful awareness. We really can do this with the things we're engaged in already in our lives. So that's really what we're talking about. And, we each live in a culture that, we're constantly bombarded by distractions. It's not just these amazing phones we carry around with us that are beeping and ringing all the time. But, there's just always something or someone vying for our attention. And so it's a real skill to be able to notice when the mind becomes distracted. In fact, my favorite definition of mindfulness comes from the mindfulness teacher, Jon Kabat-Zinn. And the definition that he has used is paying attention to the present moment on purpose without judgment. And so this on purpose piece, I think, is really what we're talking about. So when we pay attention to the present moment on purpose, we're kind of stepping back, we're becoming the observer of our own experience. And so we notice when we become distracted, or we notice when we're trapped in recursive negative thinking. And this is common for a lot of us, especially when we're in a high stress situation like caregiving. We can be really hard on ourselves. There can be a lot of self-judgment, a lot of self-recrimination, a lot of doubt, a lot of dread of, where this is going with my loved one, for instance, or the person I'm caring for. And that sort of thinking can serve a purpose. But I think really what we're talking about is reclaiming choice. Like in this moment, I don't need to think about those things. I just need to stay what's focused or what's right here in front of me. And the benefit of that is that it really just relieves us of, so many of the thoughts that generate, if not negative, just not so useful emotions.
Right.
And a focused mind is a less exhausted mind, We're able to stay in the role and stay active, I think, longer when we're not as susceptible to the kind of unconscious distraction where, our thoughts just take us away and become really burdensome. So this ability to come back again and again, I think, is really, really useful for caregivers. When we talk about mindfulness, there are three primary benefits that we often talk about. And in the context of caregiving, I think it's really useful to point these out. And, the first one is just calm. So when we learn how to just focus on what's right in front of us, it just allows us to stay steady and just calmer. And as I mentioned, this is healthier for the caregiver, but it's also really supportive for the person we're caring for. So each of us have been born with these amazing brains, and we have these mirror neurons. And as relational beings, we're constantly responding to each other's energy. And so we all know what it feels like to be in the presence of someone who's highly agitated. If we're not paying attention to our own mind, our own process, we can start to get really agitated as well, right?
Right.
Well, it's also true that, if I'm calm and steady, I can have a calming effect on the person I'm with. And that's just healthier for them. The second benefit that we often talk about is just enhanced focused attention. And this has really practical applications in caregiving. So, if we're joining a loved one for a medical appointment, we do a better job of, say, taking notes or, tracking what the physician is saying, for instance. Or if we're responsible for assisting with medications, like it helps us make sure that we don't make mistakes, So, and, when our attention is focused on the person we're with, we allow them to experience a sense of deep human connection. And I think ultimately, whether we're living with, chronic long-term illness or if we're at the end of our life, I think that's really what we're craving. That's what we yearn for. And, if we're with a caregiver who's just highly distracted, we don't feel that sense of connection. And, that's unfortunate, I think. So when, as a caregiver, you're undistracted and your attention is fully rested on the person you're with, it allows them to feel this deep sense of human connection. And ultimately, whether we're dealing with a long-term chronic illness or we're at the end of our life, I think that's what's most healing. I think that's what we all crave, ultimately. And while that sense of connection may not be curative, it certainly reminds us of our connection to something bigger than ourselves and the narrow circumstances that we're dealing with. And and we just simply can't provide that kind of connection without, focused attention. And then the third benefit of mindfulness is increased or enhanced awareness. And this is extremely relevant in caregiving because especially when the person we're caring for perhaps reaches a point where they're no longer verbal. With increased awareness, we can attune ourselves to nonverbal cues. It might be facial gestures or hand gestures, and we're just better able to respond to those sorts of cues. But it also allows us to be more perceptive to what's happening in the environment that may have an impact on their sense of well-being. And so we can address things in the space. But then when it comes to self-awareness as a caregiver, it just allows us to better track, how am I doing? So when we reach a point of exhaustion or when something starts showing up in the body that maybe is going to lead to illness, we can address it more readily. And, we were talking about self-care and then we kind of went off in this other direction. But, one of the big points around self-care and, moment-to-moment self-care that I think is important to make is, I watch this with my dad. A lot of caregivers will put their needs aside because there's no one else to take up the role. but that only works for so long. In the book, I compare this to, driving a car where the gas gauge is not functioning. You can do it for a while, but sooner or later, you're going to run out of gas, and it's going to create a real headache for you and your passengers. So when we don't tend to the needs of the body, it's only going to last for so long. And in my father's experience, we didn't know how sick he was. And it sounds strange to put it this way, but, thankfully he lasted until my mom died. But then as soon as my mom died, we got through the funeral, and, in our tradition, we sat Shiva for a few days, and then, he went into the hospital, and he had a systemic infection throughout his body. And we had no idea. And he had been dealing with this for quite a while, but he felt like he just couldn't go down because he couldn't ask anyone else to step in. So the point is, tending to these small needs of the body and the mind early on, it helps us stay in the role for much longer and prevent other sorts of problems that are created if the caregiver goes down. So, so mindful caregiving it's really just about tending to what's here and tracking our experience moment to moment. And I often say mindfulness is about honesty and authenticity. It's an honest acknowledgement of what's really happening here. And sometimes that means just being able to say to yourself, wow, this is really hard, or, this is not working for me. And those are difficult things to acknowledge, but necessary for one's own sake and the sake of the person you're caring for.
I would think that having the ability to be mindful would be very, very useful, especially towards the last days and weeks of life. What you were describing, when your person becomes nonverbal, but when they begin to actively die as well, to be able to be aware of the breathing patterns and these minimal changes that when you're sitting there watching it from hour to hour may not seem big, but when you're looking at the decline and the body's way of shutting itself down, those are big things. But to be able to be mindful of that, I love the practical approach of this, because having a habit of mindfulness established inside your caregiving, multitasking is it's just sort of a natural consequence, natural behavior of a caregiver. But to have an ability to practice mindfulness inside, it's not asking you to step out, with your own little meditation room and your chimes and, setting aside space. You've got to be able to incorporate it into what you're already doing. Laundry, that's a thing, right?
It's got to get done.
Yeah. So multitasking is a thing. So what if you could multitask in something like this mindfulness, folding the laundry, feeling the fabrics, feeling the warmth of it? Here's an example that I think might be useful when you're helping your person bathe. I had a hospice mentor who taught me, with the very first death I witnessed, find the water. Go to where the water is if you're able to, as part of your self-care, a lake, a pond, the ocean, whatever works for you. But on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour basis, feel the water as you wash your hands. Feel it flow over your hands. Things like that can be incorporated into what you're already doing as a caregiver. Because you certainly can't say, okay, you need to block off an entire hour for a bubble bath. It's not realistic. People aren't going to do that. But having a calmer caregiver promotes a sense of safety and security and calm and peace in the person who's being cared for. I think it could have a a caregiver practicing mindfulness can have such a big impact on the person receiving the care as well.
Absolutely. And, it's not hard for us. We were sharing our ages earlier, and without stating our ages, we both are to a point in life where we can imagine ourselves, needing the support of a caregiver. And when I think about the kind of caregiver I want for myself, I want someone who's really well resourced internally so that they can be calm, again, for their own sake, but also for mine. So I think most people, that's the kind of caregiving they want. They don't want someone who's a victim of what sometimes we call monkey mind or, extreme agitation, because that's just not so healthy, right? So I think, it's a really worthy pursuit, as you say, figuring out how to just be with whatever's showing up in the present moment in a calm and steady state. And that's not always going to be possible, but even when it's not possible, to have the awareness that, wow, like I am really agitated in this moment, like even that's healthier than just being so swept up in the agitation, being unconscious of it. You said something else that I think is so important. In those final days and hours of life, it's so important to apply mindful awareness and be with what's emerging in each unfolding moment, because as painful as it's going to be emotionally, and even filled with, doubt and fear, those are precious moments. When my loved one has breathed their last breath and they're no longer here with us, we will think back on those moments. And do we want to think back on an experience of being so highly distracted or overwhelmed by our own emotional experience or overwhelmed by what's happening in the room? Or do we want to think back on an experience where, I was really, really there for that? And it's such a precious time. So it's nice to be able to just kind of slow it all down and just be with what's unfolding. And, no one has come back after their death to tell us that, wow, that was really supportive and in service of a good death for me. But I have to believe, that's how people want to be held. They don't want to be held with, high emotionality and agitation, but grace, right? Like just a calm state of clear attention, open-heartedness, and grace. And it's going to work that way sometimes, and other times it's not. And ultimately, after a death, that too is a time, it's an opportunity to practice mindful awareness. And, in the book, so the first section is on mindfulness. The second section is on compassion. And then I'll just share the third and fourth. The third section is on loss, and the fourth section is on what I call intimacy. But that second section, compassion, is so important because it grows out of mindful awareness, and it allows us to hold space for ourselves when we're not living up to the ideal we have for ourselves in terms of not just how much we can accomplish or get done, but how well we can stay present and kind to our loved one. Because we're going to have moments where we kind of lose it and we're very reactive and perhaps unskillful. And, we can either dwell in those moments and, beat ourselves up, or we can express compassion to ourselves and acknowledge, being human means I'm going to mess up sometimes, and I'm not alone. This is just what it's like to be human. Other people experience that. But in this moment, I can at least be kind to myself and acknowledge that it's going to be okay and move on from there, stay really present.
Approaching it that way has to support an after caregiving life where the regrets are much less.
I think so.
Yeah. Today was my best. This is what my best looked like today.
Yeah.
My best was different yesterday.
Right.
But to be able to get all the way through it, and then as part of your grief journey, you're processing and, reflecting back on everything that you said and everything that you did. But to be able to say, this was my best this day.
Yeah. Absolutely. It reminds me, so in the 4th section of the book, there's a chapter on setting intention or using intention in our caregiving. And, as humans, we have this ability to look out into the future and think about, who do I want to become? Who is the person I want to be? So it can be in the future, but it can also be in, okay, so, I'm driving to my father's home. My father is in the final stages of his life. Like, how do I want to show up for this experience? Like, who do I want to be here? How do I want to meet this? And it's something that we're aiming for with the acknowledgement that we're going to veer off that path. We're going to make mistakes, but I can always return to that path. And I can always go back to aiming for that particular goal. And so I think this becomes really useful because it sets up an ideal for ourselves on who we want to be. And then, when we don't really cut it, we just try again. It's like the meditation practice or the mindfulness practice. Every breath, every sensation is an opportunity to begin again. And, I've used this word already, but there's a certain grace in that. And I think when we can live our lives that way, people are noticing. You talked about your grandchildren, and I don't know how old they are, but, they're watching you, right? And they're learning from you.
It's true.
And, when they sneeze into your face, as you were mentioning, your ability to just roll with that is making an impression on them, And we were talking about the advanced medical directives, and how do we learn how to hold an experience of completing those things, even when emotions start to show up? We're learning from our elders, those around us who have walked the path before us. So I think for caregivers, it's really not to add more pressure to them, but to remind them is important that they are being witnessed and they're making an impression on people around them. Even when a caregiver is feeling extremely isolated, as so many caregivers do, they may feel like they have severed their relationships or ties to a community of friends and even family in the experience of providing care. But people are noticing, they're learning from you as you go through this experience. And we started to talk a little bit about, the grief experience, so post-death. And, I've seen so many caregivers who have walked someone through the experience of living the end of their life. And then they have taken the gifts of that experience. They've taken what they've learned. And then they have found ways to channel that wisdom, those gifts, to the benefit of others, So they show up to serve, as a volunteer, or they, look for opportunities to support other caregivers that they know. And that's kind of the part of this reciprocity we're talking about, It's just we're all in this together, right? So the reason I love this way of thinking about caregiving, the fact that we're making an impression on others around us, is that, this is just how we evolve as a people. This is how we care for the community that we may be part of. This is how we learn from each other. And it allows caregivers to find purpose when there can be so much suffering. Yeah. And they start to feel like there's no longer a sense of meaning in their difficulty and in the burden of providing care. But while it may not be obvious, in the moment, the purpose and meaning becomes clear perhaps after the fact, when we realize, wow, I've learned a lot from that experience, and I can give it back. I can share it with people.
Yeah. You are modeling it for the people who might be the ones to take care of you.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. To teach them. So, Roy, there are 63 million unpaid family caregivers in the U.S. There's a huge population of caregivers.
Huge.
If you were sitting with someone who was just starting out as a caregiver, what advice would you give them?
Oh, I love this question. The advice I would say is, don't wait until you start to experience signs of exhaustion or burnout to learn the types of approaches and skills that I'm talking about in the book, the kinds of approaches and skills that really will support you as your caregiving experience becomes more burdensome. So, use whatever time you have now as you're stepping into this role to cultivate these kinds of skills, because they will serve you and they will be beneficial for you and the person you're caring for. And the other thing I would say to a new caregiver is, this is going to get heavy. It's going to become burdensome and really hard. And you will not only survive this experience, but you can actually thrive in the experience and really grow in the experience. And, so many caregivers I've been with in our classes that we teach, and I've met otherwise, they carry a sense of hopelessness, like, this experience is going to destroy me. But when they start to acquire some of these skills, it's as if a sense of hope is being returned to them, and a vision for actually thriving in the experience. So I think that's important to remind people of.
Yeah, caregivers should be hopeful in a way. I love it. Okay, Zen Caregiving, How to Care for Yourself While Caring for Others. It's a beautiful, beautiful book, beautifully written. I love the cover. Where can listeners find the book and connect with you?
Sure. Well, ask for it at your local bookstores, or you can find it in online retailers of books. If you were to visit us at zencaregiving.org, you can learn more about the book and learn more about my work and the work of our organization, Zen Caregiving Project. We offer classes for caregivers, and caregivers, no matter where they're located, can engage in our classes because they're offered online remotely. There's even a self-paced course. So, it's out there. And I want to just really thank all the caregivers out there for the work that they're doing. And thank you, Helen, for this opportunity. I'm really grateful.
I love the energy that you're bringing to the work as you're caring for caregivers, Roy. Thank you so much for being on the show.
All right. Thank you. Take care now.
Thanks for listening to the Heart of Hospice podcast. Check out our sponsor in the show notes, and please leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. We would appreciate it if you would share this episode with your friends and family and anyone who needs to know more about hospice. Connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, no matter who you are or where you are in your hospice journey, you are the heart of hospice.
This is the Whole Care Network. Helping you tell your story one podcast at a time.